Good morning, BookTube. We are back. This is Amal Clark coming to you with Better Worlds Theory YouTube edition. I am joined as always by my special guest, The Highway. The Highway is at its quietest on a Sunday morning because Ciclovia closes half of the route for quieter throughfare. And yet, even just this morning, there was already a funeral procession disrupting the works. And funeral processions here can be very loud affairs. So I have already been recording this a few times. I actually recorded this whole piece last week, but when I listened to it again, I heard that my neighbors had a party. And even though I couldn't quite pick up as many of those sounds while I was recording, yep, they got picked up, so maybe I should have left it in for some party fare. Instead, we are going to be redoing this piece, hopefully a little bit cleaner in some ways, but hopefully you can enjoy the ambiance no matter what. So as I have discussed routinely, I don't like the video format for myself. I quite enjoy other people's video formats, but as a writer, it's just not my medium of choice. And yet, I think it's really important to have some conversations, as many conversations as we can, about the work in speculative fiction, the industry, as well as the people around it, our aspirations, our hope, what it is that we look for when we engage with speculative writing. In large part because this is a difficult era for many of our publications, many of our venues. So we have this disconnect between our aspirations and how much we sometimes believe that the telling of better stories can yield the creation of a better world, and the hard reality, which is that this is an industry which is undergoing tremendous pressures. And one of the biggest pressures is with respect to sponsorship, funding models for a lot of these publications. This is why on a monthly basis I'm now reviewing Clarkesworld, just to give folks more of an understanding of what's happening across the board in some of the most accessible publications. Clarkesworld is free to read, and that when it came out, when it started, that was kind of an exceptional thing because subscription models were so important for the old school way of doing things, and yet there came with the internet a sense of entitlement. Why can't I access all content? Well, because there's a difficult, very material push-pull between the publications being able to stay in business. And that's why today I wanted to go back to another happy place. And it's not just a happy place, I think, for me. It's a happy place for most folks who have had any engagement with science fiction in their lives. Asimov's was one of the first publications that I read. I was very fortunate to have access as a young person not only to some of the most up-to-date content at the time through my father's subscriptions, but also on the passing of his father, access to this wealth of work from preceding decades. And I was growing up in an era when one could find Asimov's analog fantasy and science fiction more routinely on spinner racks or otherwise in bookstores, and sometimes even more broadly in grocery stores as well. And of course, the libraries would have subscriptions on a consistent basis. So when I was growing up, there was a lot more access to this work, and it also showed up more prominently and more consistently as dominant entries for year-end anthologies. And it still does in different ways, but the industry has broadened with the digital landscape, and that shift in publication model in which many publications have free-to-read content online has, I think, skewed a little bit of the balance. Asimov's continues to be a publication that focuses on please pay a little bit to get access to this content. And hopefully more people will understand the value of investing in these venues. But right now we have this discontinuity between how much we vaguely understand the importance of telling good stories to inspire, to help navigate difficult problems for the world that we're moving through, and the actual will to invest in especially the frontline publications, the short fiction publications, where we can engineer and really explore possibilities. These are the laboratories not only for new ideas but also for new voices. So they're really important. Now I'm doing my monthly reviews of Clarkesworld, but I do want to bring in a lot more content in other spaces. Asimov's is a great start. We're going to be doing Asimov's May May-June 2024 edition. And I want to emphasize that it is a bi-monthly publication now. That means there's a lot of content in it. And that means we can't cover all of it in one of these pieces. I'm not going to be covering specifically the poetry in this issue. I did, however, want to accommodate for that fact by highlighting that very recently, just this beginning of May actually, we had the paperback publication of The Heartbeat of the Universe, Poems from Asimov Science Fiction and Analog Science Fiction in Fact, 2012 to 2022, edited by Emily Hockaday, who's just a lovely person to work with if you ever have the opportunity. I should mention I've been fortunate enough to have some of my work published in both analog and fantasy and science fiction. I've never had the privilege of Asimov's, although some of the stories that I would send to Sheila Williams would then later find homes elsewhere. They just didn't quite fit. And that's a really important aspect of talking about these publications. There are some writers, especially, I think maybe aspirational writers, who think that if they have just the most amazing story, oh my goodness, why wouldn't any of these publications want to have me in their pages? And I'm thinking to myself a little bit like, that's great confidence. I have never gone through life with that much confidence, but I do know I've heard it from others who have this sense of like, well, the story is good, so why shouldn't the publication take it? And they miss the point. And I think they miss the point, unfortunately, because they don't read the publications. This is a bugbear of mine, but I really strongly believe that if you were going to submit to publications, you should read them. You should know what they're looking for. You should know if you enjoy the content on those pages. Do you want to be part of that publication? Do you want your work to be present there? And for whatever reason, I think a lot of people are less interested in thinking about the curatorial side of the industry because they just want to be published. And I think that does a disservice to all parts of the industry, including the writer, because it is important to remember every publication has a vantage point, it has a voice, and one of the gems, the absolute joys of Asimov's, is that its voice has been fairly consistent for quite some time. This doesn't mean there haven't been changes over time, but there is a level and there is an attention to the quality of prose in this publication that was just such a treat to come home to. And when I say come home to, I mean, I think everybody who's had any passing association with science fiction as an industry knows Asimov's. And they might even have read it when they were younger. And even though so much has changed in the genre, if you go back to Asimov's now, or analog, both of them have this consistency, fantasy and science fiction as well. But right now we're just going to focus on the science fiction side of things. There is a strong familiarity in the pages. It doesn't mean we're rehashing old news. It means that the aesthetic direction of this publication is robust and has stayed fairly constant for generations, which is just wonderful. So I was quite fortunate growing up. I had access not only to my father's subscriptions for certain points in my childhood, but also when my grandfather passed, his wealth of issues from earlier eras. And I also grew up at a time when you could find Asimov's analog and fantasy and science fiction more often in libraries and more often in bookstores and even grocery stores. But we're not quite at that era anymore because the print model has changed, and it's a challenge to keep up with the rising costs of printing. And that's why publications like Asimov's and Analog and fantasy and science fiction have had to create some hybrid models. You can now acquire a digital subscription quite effectively, easily, and it will just drop the new issue in your inbox every 2 months. We really do need to be supporting our publications a lot more, but there is that lovely tension between our excitement about what fiction can do and the material realities that underpin what that science fiction can do. So I think we're a very confused industry because there's so much tension between I want to be able to read all the things, everything should be free to read online, and if it's not free to read online, it can't be important or can't possibly speak to our moment. And for writers, a lot of people, I want to get published, I've got the most amazing story, why won't all of these other editors fall over backwards to put me on their pages. Again, I'm impressed by that confidence. I've published free for many, many, many years and across many forums, and I'm still always astonished and excited whenever I get a new acceptance. In my book, everything is a rejection until it is an acceptance. And even the rejections I've received from Sheila Williams over the years have been wonderful and clarifying, and those stories going forward sometimes to be published elsewhere were better for it. So it is an intricate industry. It deserves investment, and that's why we are going to spend time looking at this issue. So we're not going to focus on the poetry. I am going to highlight a little bit from the nonfiction, but again, in a fairly cursory way compared to the time I take with it in other spaces. But again, some things just don't change. It's just such a wonderful, reliable format, and you can do so much with it over the generations. So in this issue, we do have a guest editorial from A.T. Greenblatt reflecting on vertical farming and the idea of reaching for a better future. Greenblatt is associated with the vertical farming industry, and that little note of conflict of interest in writing about this is definitely made clear in the piece. And yet, despite that conflict of interest, Greenblatt does hold in tension the pros, the cons, the questions around vertical farming, which is what any good speculative writer should do. We also have a piece in Reflections from Robert Silverberg, who has made an entire career, if more or less, out of talking about all human species and reflecting on the wonder that is being human in a world of other primate possibilities. And that comes up again in the Reflections More Shaggy Cousins that's listed in this issue. So if you grew up with a lot of prominent writers from other eras, it's wonderful sometimes to see them still kicking and still sharing wonderful thoughts on the page today. And then also getting to see how that conversation has grown over time, because obviously our understanding of anthropology has changed significantly over the writing. This is true for many forms of science fiction, and yet it's so wonderful to be able to go back and see some of that earlier work. A few years ago, we had this wonderful collection about stories from science fiction writers excited in an era before we knew as much about Venus as we now do. And there's just such a joy and a pleasure going back to some of those early wondrous tales, simply because they should give us a sense of humility. We're writing today without full knowledge either, and so someone's going to look back on our work with the same kind of mixed nostalgia and a bit of a chuckle to see what we got right and what we got wrong. So it's lovely to have a publication of record and authors of record whose careers can speak to that constancy in the conversation, what's changed and what has stayed consistent with respect to our sense of curiosity. We also have this lovely piece by James Patrick Kelly on the net, Lengthwise, which I think perfectly addresses something that you'll also find in publications like Asimov's and Analog, which is this breakdown of stories by whether they're a novella, a novelette, or a short story. You won't see that in something like Clark's World, where you'll just have stories. But that breakdown has been very important for many of these older publications, in part because it's tied into award circuits and tied into what is in competition with what other kind of work at the end of the year. So there is something very commercial, and James Patrick Kelly pushes back on our sense of value by looking at the fact that historically quite a few works that we might think of conceptually as novels because they were so prominent, so important, were actually shorter pieces of fiction. So it's all quite fluid. Oh, I said I wasn't going to spend too much time on the nonfiction, but it is a really good category. Thought Experiment, Giant Monsters, Kaiju, and the Bomb in Godzilla by Kelly Lagor also definitely highlights the fact that we have so many different subgenres and concepts and thematic priorities and tension. So there is this is a wonderful piece reflecting on the conversation around those three concepts and how it continues to be extremely fruitful for writers today. This is very much, I should add, a publication that is lovingly in service both to readers of science fiction and also very much to writers too. And Kelly Jennings has an on-book section that is wonderful because when you're looking through reviews, you really want to get a sense of the reviewer's voice. I say this as someone who reviews fiction for Strange Horizons myself. You really are only learning the reviewer's take on a given work, and yet that can be quite useful if you have an understanding of how that take plays out over the course of many different works. So in an article which looks at 5 different pieces, you can really start to flesh out Jennings' priorities, and through an understanding of those priorities, understand whether the work itself is something that might be of interest to you. So the 5 pieces discussed here: Justin C. Keyes, The World Wasn't Ready for You; Aubrey Wood's Big Bang Bang Bodhisattva; Malka Older's The Mimicking of Known Successes; Melissa Scott's The Master of Samar; and Martha Wells' Witch King. So a wide range of work through which you can get some good ruminations. Okay, but now we actually have to talk about the fiction. So this is the important part. And I have to say, it's been a while. Coming back to Asimov's after, I think the last one that I read was a couple years ago, but I'd fallen off for the last couple of years. Everything got very strange in pandemic, for sure. But there's a sense of giddiness that comes back to good storytelling. And even though the TOC, the table of contents for this piece, is organized by novellas and short stories and novelettes, we're going to go through the actual reading order, because I just want to share my experience as I move through this work. I just also want to highlight how comfortable and warm the conversation can be in this kind of confident set of writing hands, and under this kind of curatorial power. So Sheila Williams puts together a very controlled issue, and these pieces that are selected are going to necessarily be treading on certain common tropes, but in very seasoned ways. So we start with Rich Larson. And Rich Larson is a seasoned voice in the genre, and you can feel that in the way that the writing, we don't want to use words like effortless, because a lot of work goes into this, but there is a kind of confidence that is earned in Rich Larson's use of a lot of jargon for the science fictional realm, and you can trust that jargon. You know it's in the hands of someone who's going to use it not to overwhelm or confuse you, but to immerse you in another world. I'll give you one quick example. I'll actually name a few words. We've got wild words like razor mug, warjack, dead swimmers. But honestly, I think the funniest one in this piece was the name for the weapon, because naming weapons in a sci-fi context can sometimes be a little bit ridiculous. It's going to be a laser gun or something like that, a las gun. No, in this case, it's called a Chekhov. And maybe not all of you are apprised of the literary background, but the idea of Chekhov's gun going off is a seasoned literary device, and it's a cheeky move to name your firearm in a story after a term that is associated with the idea that if we're going to have a firearm in a story, it's going to go off at some point. That's going to be a key part of the tale. And yet, in the right hands, with somebody who has a very comfortable sense of their writing style, it doesn't come off as ridiculous. It just comes off as an element of play that says, welcome to my world. And that's what you get from this kind of science fiction. So this is a very familiar atmosphere, in the sense that we have these kinds of spaceships and strange changes in bodies. Our protagonist is in a complicated work relationship with somebody who's no longer fully in a body because of a punishment that the other person took on when the first person, or main protagonist, really kind of possibly was the guiltier party. So they have a complicated work and life relationship, trying to do all kinds of odd jobs to get by in the universe with the ship that they have, and with all the perils that await. Their current job is running 2 people, which our protagonist names X and Y. It's important at some point, but the names I will not get into too much. We'll just call them X and Y for now. These 2 characters want to go to a particular planet, and so this main cast of people, Yana and Tilly, are going to help. It's going to drag them into a little bit of a treasure hunt. It's going to drag them into an inheritance contest, and it's going to drag them into some really deep questions of loyalty, which are coded for from the beginning, from that tension between the two main characters, our main protagonist, and the pseudo body that remains of the other one. All of it is done in estranging terms because it is science fiction, but it is deeply human. The core questions of loyalty, who is family, senses of betrayal, what it means to try to do right in very difficult situations. And it's just a romp. It is a romp that is in good hands and an absolute pleasure. It's filled with twists and turns, but it has a heart to it, which is so important for stories from Asimov. So a lot of people think that science fiction magazines are all about the pew-pew, and they are absolutely not. And if you try to submit to Asimov's just on the basis of having tech, you are going to forget that this publication accepts stories that engage with tech in a way that really negotiates the humanity involved. And not just always tech, there are going to be pieces more on the fantastical side, but even then, it's the humanity first. These are character-driven stories. Okay, so Rich Larson's wonderful romp starts us up in that very strong sci-fi mode, and then we switch to something a little bit different. Honestly, I think this is one of my new favorites in terms of stories about pandemic. So thank you, Kristine, Kathryn, Rusch, for Last Thursday, which is a time travel story. And it involves the idea that imagine in the future you do have access to time travel technology. Where would you want to go? What kind of great events would you want to see? Probably a lot of great choices. What would be one of the worst years to possibly go back and revisit is probably going to be 2020. And this is a story about someone trying to negotiate their tedium with finally having their ticket to go back in time and being stuck in probably one of the most degrading human experiences. It was degrading, I'll say, after a point. At the beginning, there was this moment of solidarity. I was like, we'll come together, we'll get through this. And then we realized that every zombie movie and every disaster movie of totalizing apocalypse definitely misled us into thinking that we would be much more unified as a species than we actually are. So this is a very person-oriented story, an individual struggling with the tedium of going back to 2020 as a time traveler. And there are some twists and turns, and also one really cute device. Again, there are these warm elements in these stories that let you know these are writers who have a whole career of work behind them, so they understand the deeper workings of story. And there is this cute moment where this character is very much fixated by a poster that we can read, we understand as a joke, but they might not. And that kind of play comes through somebody who's a seasoned hand at the written word. So you really are, again, in the hands of somebody who knows 100% what they're doing, and you can trust that it's going to be a warm, thoughtful journey. The next piece, short story, again, tremendously generous, warm, kind-hearted approach to robots. And I cannot stress this enough. That is what makes speculative fiction worthwhile. It's not the technology, it's the reflection on the humanity around it, how innovation, how negotiation of what-ifs changes us or doesn't change us. So Adazem 2 is Waiting for a Letter by Amal Singh. Starts as a certain kind of story, and it feels like it is very much a story shaped around machines, but it is not. It, like everything else, it's about us, it's about our moment, it's about who counts, it's about what kind of people can hope for a better future for themselves, and what kind of people, at best, can create a future for others. And it's just tremendously generous. So we have this post-war robot just trying to make enough credits to earn freedom. They're working as a grunt, odd jobs here and there, in a city where there are people resentful of the robots that served in the war because they might have stolen valor from humans in the past. And the city as well is on the verge of an anti-bot revolution in total. As you go further through the story, you get a strong sense of resonance points with displacement pressures and class-based pressures that exist in our world. It's never heavy-handed, it's really warm-hearted, It's a reminder that all of our lives are filled with their own deep stories, even if most of those stories aren't shared or never get to be as famous or as prominent. So there are many ways in which people live with great dignity in a world that just constantly strips us of our own. So, lovely piece again. Then we have a novelette called The Rattler. This is in translation, and I have to be very careful how I talk about this story because the story itself is exceptionally good. It might seem very run-of-the-mill at first, and it gets to some tremendously nuanced places. And then it's followed by a note that also adds another layer to it. I will not talk about the note, but it is a rich, layered experience. It's by Leonid Kaganov, and it's translated by Alex Shvartsman. It was first published in 2022, and it is a war story. But it uses an excellent adjacent analogy to try to talk about some of the problems that we face. So we are in a world where there is an alien presence that has landed on the planet. This Rattler is very strange, confusing, terrifying creature that kills 30 million humans a year. And it very randomly, it seems, or if there is an order to it, it's just not an order that human beings really understand. And because they don't understand it, they don't know how to respond to it. Because if anybody could just be killed at any moment, 30 million a year, maybe that's not so big a price to pay, and people resign themselves. So there is within the story another analogy that's used to try to help people think about resistance. We're getting resistance from the perspective of journalists, the media that is trying to report on this phenomenon in a way that can actually motivate people to change, to pursue change and to resist. And there's a story about pirates and cannibals. The idea of if a pirate were stranded on an island and there were cannibals all around them, there has to be a way that the pirate would stave off the cannibals. Otherwise, there are more cannibals than there are this one lone pirate. The cannibals would overwhelm it. The same with the Rattler. It's just one alien. So you'd think that all of the humans working together could overwhelm it, and yet they can't because of some mitigating factors that come up through that philosophical discussion. That philosophical discussion does lead, however, the media crew to think of a way to defeat this machine, and that's where the story has this extra wonderful level because the media is not going to be thanked for it. It's going to be seen as having failed and been dishonest for the way it goes about things. So it's just a rich story, many layers, and then on top of that, the final note adds something more. I think you'll enjoy it. I think folks who are struggling to find work that truly responds to the pain of war in our age will find some very satisfying reflections in this piece. Followed by something on quite a different side of the spectrum, but again, a generous, warm-hearted, and very human piece. This is possibly the most fantastical of the stories, and it's a gentle story. It's a very slice-of-life fantasy. The fantastical element is very light. It's called The Shadow Box by M. Bennardo, and it follows the idea of shadow birds. There is a son and his parents. We're seeing this through the father's lens. The son has excitedly engaged with something in the natural environment around them, something that seems to be made up, this conspiracy theory of bird boxes specifically for a kind of shadow bird. And so mom and dad have the sense that it's not real, there is no such thing as a shadow bird, but the dad is so excited because his son is excited about something. And so he uses his son's excitement about something as an excuse to be present and to do things and to build things. And the generous turn in the story about childhood innocence framed around these fantastical creatures that may or may not exist is that it also speaks to the question of when and where adults give themselves permission to have wonder in their lives. So I will add too that when I read Asimov's as a kid, I also came into it excitedly thinking about the tech possibilities. And I remember being baffled sometimes by the stories that were deeply human, deeply focused on relationships, deeply focused on domestic moments. And there was a tension to that. I would be puzzled over it. And yet it was such a formative part of my experience to be reminded that the story does not happen around the material technology. It happens in these other spaces. So there are many wonderful kinds of literature that one can use to grow as a young person. And I think it's absolutely a disservice to children to suggest that science fiction and fantasy are just about technological possibilities and can only provide that level of depth. I'm so thankful that I grew up with Asimov's analog fantasy and science fiction around so many others, because they were fairly mature publications and they did talk about mature themes, not in the superficial way of just violence and sex, no, but in terms of relationships and senses of what we owe to one another and to ourselves. Okay, so the next piece is a novella. And speaking about that journey from youth to adulthood, To Make an End is the final piece in William Preston's series. He's written many stories in the Old Man series, and you can find a lot of conversations about them online. You can hopefully find access to all of them. I think I will see if I can find a specific link and put that in the notes with this. The stories have grown with the author, and I think that's wonderful. And so Preston's talked about how this last one was very difficult, challenging to write, in part because of how the world has mediated a lot of the discussions that came out in the earlier pieces. So you have this really complex tension about how to change the world and the damage we do along the way, and how one moves through the world. When one has a kind of worldly fatigue, you can see clearly certain things and certain you think you can see certain bigger realities, and yet you will always be haunted by the specific. This is the tension I think that a lot of us face again when looking at the world today and the news today, is that we can on one level see what needs to be done, and we also have to live through the material realities of our moment. So this final piece, you don't have to read the others before reading it to get the benefit. It pulls from a lot of what's come before, in terms of the fact that individual actions and the flawed nature of human beings in trying to rise above individual circumstances will always come back and haunt you. So we have our old man meeting some new characters and engaging in the world at a time when he's very much become myth and legend and almost kind of a cult among people who have undergone tremendous damage. The world has seen many awful issues since the last time the old man was part of it, and yet some things abide, some damage abides, and the old man is going to have to confront one of the most damaging parts of his journey through trying to make the world a little better than when he found it, because the cyclicality of human nature, I think, is the most important facet of this whole arc. It comes through, I think, in Shoshana's character has one really interesting line. They're two younger people, Isaac and Shoshana. Shoshana's the older sister, and Shoshana has seen enough cycles of damage and destruction that her abiding fear is just that her younger brother is never going to be able to know a world that isn't on the cusp of ruin. And so that was, I think, a very salient point, because we can get acclimated to that. We can get acclimated to thinking that that is always going to be the way of things. So it is a story in the sci-fi mode with conflict and technology, but these abiding overall themes, I think, are beautifully satisfied in this final piece. And hopefully after you read it, you'll think, okay, let's go back and look at the author's journey. And I think you might also find that some of the earlier pieces, the author themselves hadn't been through enough of the journey to know where it was going to go. So there is something quite satisfying here to seeing an end to the series, more or less, but also to see this conversation having grown so much over the pieces over time. So thank you to Preston for that one. We also have a story by Elena Pavlova. This is another one in translation, translated by the author with help by Kalin M. Nenov. It's called Renting to Killers. This one is a really striking story, again, to highlight the difference between Asimov's in practice and the way a lot of writers think that any sci-fi publication is absolutely going to love certain kinds of work about certain themes. It has a kind of Mad Max setup in terms of a future of water scarcity, a lot of dustiness, and a lot of lacking material goods, and then you have these kind of remote spaces where people are living or trying to get by in their machines, moving from one space to another, and either trying to inflict maximum harm or trying to avoid as much violence as one can. But just having that kind of setup is not sufficient for inclusion in Asimov's or in many other publications today. You have to say something. You have to go a little bit further. So the first part of the story is a little bit of a straightforward setup where you have this sort of boarding house with a young daughter who's going to have very unfortunate, awful things happen to her because of the twins, these menaces of human beings in this landscape. And then she's going to be avenged with their deaths. And if the story was just that, it would not be something that would merit conclusion in Asimov's. What happens around that, again, tying into the idea that writing and the thoughts about storytelling are so important to the kind of work that one gets in publications like this, the person who does the revenge narrative leaves, and then the other characters learn a little bit more about what had happened through a story written by that person, published in another magazine, because apparently this is maybe the most fantastical and optimistic part of this futurescape, is that maybe there will still be print publications even if you're in a time of water scarcity, a Mad Max scenario, which is an adorable thought, but it's the kind of thing you get from writers. But there is that interesting, devastating note in this piece, closing note, about whether the violence is just in service to the story and whether that story is worth telling if it is predicated on so much violence. So it is an interesting journey, but especially because it elevates what some people will see as the most important part of the story. Oh yeah, no, we have a boarding house, we've got a girl in peril, we've got violence happening to her, we have retaliatory violence happening, end of story. No, our genre goes a little bit harder than that. The next piece, In the Palace of Science by Chris Campbell, has a different, more patient tone. So it's, again, curation is lovely because you go from this sort of dystopian future landscape, tight writing, short, punchy, and very shock value in certain ways, a lot of violence, to a very steady, patient, luxuriating read. A read that luxuriates in the time it takes to tell itself. It has a little bit of, I would say, anywhere from Victorian to Edwardian to early 20th century writing. There was a kind of patience in many of these stories as they were setting and establishing the context. And now sometimes writers go back and think, oh, they just didn't know how to tell a good story yet. They just didn't know how to tell a story that starts in the middle of the action, medias res. This one's way too much setup. No, it's a different kind of story. And the story that's being told here is, there is a surface. We've got a professor. We have a mentee that becomes an important part of his practice, studying in his home and learning the arts through him. We have a mountain of mathematical and physics discourse, hand-waved a bit, but there in quite a substantial quantity. And then on the other side, we have the material, applied science. They build a machine together. And so these are the surface elements of the story. Beyond that, you have something that is very Victorian, maybe even more than Victorian. It goes back sometimes to the early 1800s. There is an early 1800s aesthetic to this kind of storytelling too. So we got to a point, and then commercial fiction came around and told us everything needs to be snappy and to the point. Not always. But the deeper tension here is an abstract reflection on the value of science itself. So what's in the Palace of Science? Well, it has this body of abstract theory, which can lead to dangerous outcomes if abused. And it has this body of applied science, which can lead to dangerous outcomes if abused. And then there's the question of what one does when one's research or when one's thinking compels one down certain roads that make those destructive endings seem inevitable. So even though it's a surface level story, it is also a fairly abstracted piece. I think, I honestly think Gene Wolfe would have enjoyed this piece. So it just has that sort of steady, patient feel to it, and it allows you to sit with some of the bigger questions. Okay. The next one is a brief little flash piece, and the publication doesn't list flash separately, but it does have a full range. So just take the time to tell your story. If it needs to be a novella, it needs to be a novella. Sometimes it doesn't. This one, Cynthia in the Subflooring by Christopher Rowe, is, again, a lovely little meditation about wonder itself. And it's just, in terms of surface level story, about Cynthia falling to the floor and then falling through the floor to a slightly different realm, thinking about the rules of that realm, and then bursting past them. And it is just this lovely little affirming reminder that we are surrounded by opportunities for wonder. It's just a matter of whether we are willing to engage in the rule sets that make wonder fully possible. And then the final piece is another novella. This is Maragi's Secret by Michel Laframboise, and this one is clearly a steampunk tale, Victorian, explicitly coded as Victorian, but I'm going to emphasize one aspect in which it is Victorian in a way that most people might not realize. It imagines these cloud cities after Earth has become poisoned, and so we have lots of airships, and it's taking place on an airship, and we're going to learn about airship technologies through our character. The actual story is kind of a wander, where we don't really get a sense of quote-unquote plot so much as, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. There are a few abiding elements added to the equation to create tension, and you realize that these threads are going to have to be resolved. But a lot of it is very much using the character to explore the world, and that happens in some kinds of fiction. But I will highlight that idea of the Earth becoming poisoned was a huge part of actual speculative fiction in the Victorian era, and I don't think people know enough about the Victorian era, sorry, this is my 19th century lit scholar coming out, to realize they had anxieties too, of course. There was so much contamination, so much pollution, that they had anxieties about what it would all amount to. There was a huge anxiety in the Victorian period because they had a very strong sense of Christian exceptionalism. So empire existed because God allows it to exist. If God did not want it to exist, it wouldn't exist. Massive urban cities exist because God is giving favor to certain people. Look at their industry, look at their progress. But if one accepts those principles, then one adds the question of, well, what about all the waste? What about all of the pollution? What about all the consequences of empire? What about all of the destruction and the harm that's caused along the way? What about the underclasses? Is that also part of the design? If so, how do we rationalize it within our philosophy and our theology? And so it's a wonderful, ripe landscape, and we have a few touchstones. There are some works from the 19th century that have been carried forward, but not nearly enough to cover the full wealth of especially late Victorian and then early Edwardian fictions that manifested this anxiety about the consequences of urbanization, empire, industry, and all of the sordid underside. So the story is drawing on a strong tradition, not just of the steampunk, but also of speculative fiction of the era that is being discussed. We have here a young daughter character who has taken to the skies with her father. There's still a lot of sexism in the era and a lot of dangers that come with being a young female person at the time. And so Maragi does have a perilous situation at the hands of another ship's hand, but also has to navigate the question of what she's going to do about an animal that she finds living on the airship under the society where she knows that the outcome for this animal is not going to be good if left on its own. And yet it's interesting because the story ultimately aligns itself with our sensibilities about what is right and proper and what's the happy outcome. And yet all throughout, it highlights the fact that the happy outcome is not necessarily something that the character would always be leaning for. that the main character has priorities, financial, helping her father, that could easily have inclined her to other choices at cost to this creature that she does end up helping, but it's not guaranteed. So there's lots of tension in this piece and rich landscapes. And hopefully you can see from this range of stories just how much the settings will be quite diverse in Asimov's, and yet the aesthetic through line, the overarching character-driven human priority of the fiction is wonderful, hasn't changed. That aspect of this publication has not changed in years. It speaks to wonderful curatorial work by Sheila Williams and everyone else on the team. And it's also greatly helped by the fact that you have a range of seasoned writers who are very comfortable storytellers, by which I mean they're comfortable recognizing that the plot and the story are two different things, and that there is a warmth and generosity that adds something to the work when you bring the reader into it, when you let them know that you know they're in on the game, that everybody here knows they're reading stories, that they're reading something that is creating a sense of verisimilitude, but which is not the world. So the map is not the landscape, and that comes through very clearly in this work, that the writers in which you put your hands, you put your trust, are people who have real world concerns. They see the world around us, they see the limits that we put on ourselves and the limits that exist in our cultures, and they know that writing about it can do something. And yet they understand that it is a collaborative process. The impact of that writing is up to us. Generous, wonderful issue, filled with some terrific stories that I highly recommend. I don't think there's a single piece in this issue that I was meh about, because they each have their own strengths. And I really hope that no matter what, even if this isn't necessarily your line of fiction, this discussion will encourage you to go out and support the publications that do resonate with you, that do tell the kinds of stories you like to read and to be a part of. And if you are writing and you want to submit, please read the publication to at least get a sense of whether your writing is in the wheelhouse of what they're looking for, so that you don't waste your own time, and so that everybody can be more in conversation with one another, which is truly what storytelling is supposed to do. So thank you for your time today, and hopefully in the show notes you'll be able to see some links if you want to support Asimov's directly and get access to this publication and have yourself in line to get the next one dropped in your inbox too. Thanks for your time, and until next time, this is Amal Clark with Better Worlds Theory, YouTube edition. Cheers.